Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the beginning of the new semester of the Theory and Practice of the Musical Theatre course. Those of you who were last week on the live introductory class know how we are going to proceed this semester, and part of it is going to be those recorded short mini lectures about different aspects of the history and analysis and the present day of the genre of the musical theatre. You'll also get the links to fragments that I would like you to listen to and watch right after the mini lectures. These are the fragments I would be showing you in class if we were in class now. Plus there will be some requests for you to prepare for the next week. Most importantly, 2 full shows a week, so you know what we'll be talking about. If you're interested, if you know these shows already, it's always a good idea to rewatch them, or perhaps to see another version, another staging, or perhaps to see a stage version if you only know the film, or to see the film adaptation if you only know the stage version. But these are rather big subjects, and we could add the titles, we could add the shows almost indefinitely. So if you want more, there is definitely more to be found. But for those of you who are just beginners, or who enrolled knowing almost nothing about the musical theatre and are not fans of the genre yet, the minimum is to do the let's say requested stuff that will be mentioned during the course. So what do we start with? We start with some initial questions, like some stereotypes concerning the musical theatre as a genre, and we'll talk about the beginnings or the predecessors of the musical, the modern musical, so where it came from, where it began, and what was there before the modern musical, and when does the modern musical start. So first of all, the stereotypes. There are quite a few stereotypes regarding the musical theatre. The first one is that many people who are not well acquainted with the genre think it is American. Well, of course, everybody has heard about Broadway and the Tony Awards, probably, which are the most prestigious professional award for theatre in New York. And there are many categories for musicals as well. They are like the equivalent of the Oscars for the theatre world. But the musical is not really American in its origin, although it greatly developed in America. And of course the beginning of Broadway and this theatre culture of Broadway was very important. There is, however, almost as long, or perhaps even longer in terms of chronology, musical scene in London, in the United Kingdom. There is the Theatreland in West End, the part of London where many of the most successful and most famous theatres are located. There is the Laurence Olivier Award, which is like the British equivalent of the Tonys. And if we talk about the origins of the musical, the British genres are as important as the early American genres of popular theatre. Of course, all goes back to the ancient Greeks and the classical ancient theatre, which had music, which had a chorus, and you might say it was a very early version of the musical, but then it went a really, really long way, and we are going to talk about it later today. So the American connection is important, but it's not really an American genre. And nowadays there are so many national musical scenes that we can really talk about the musical in the age of globalization. We can talk about Polish musical as well. So many countries have their own musical theaters, and not only the national versions of classic shows, but also original material. The other stereotype is that for some people still, the musical is inherently a comedy. Those of you who know French may be aware of the fact that even the word for the musical in the French language is la comédie musicale, which doesn't necessarily mean it has to be funny. So it's not necessarily a comedy genre. There are many musicals that will make the audiences cry rather than laugh, although most of them, even the most tragic ones, have moments of comic relief. If we look at the history of the musical, perhaps originally, especially if we look at the early Broadway shows before the advent of the so-called integrated musical, the comedy aspect was important because this was basically a kind of escapist entertainment rather than serious theatre. But relatively early, already in the 1940s, or perhaps even in the later 1930s, you start having first titles that are not just mindless entertainment. It was never mindless entertainment, but the comedy is not really a necessary element of the musical play. The other stereotype is there are some stereotypes concerning the target audience. Who is it for? Who is the intended audience at the musical? And there are all kinds of ideas. It changed in time. So in the early years of Broadway, a very popular way to describe the target audience for a musical theatre would be a tired businessman. So a tired businessman was someone who was middle class, middle-aged, probably with a decent income, although not very rich, but the tickets for musicals, especially Broadway musicals, tend still to be quite expensive. So it wasn't really intended, at least originally, for the young people who didn't have a high income, or for families, or even for women, really. It was a very male genre originally, with all those elements that the creators of the shows believed might be interesting for male audience, especially a kind of tired male audience who are looking for some escape and entertainment. So basically some sexual innuendo, dancing girls in skimpy clothes, the chorus line, the famous chorus line of dancing showgirls. This was something very important, but it didn't stay like this for long. Then it started to be just theatre. So like theatre, we could just talk about different plays and different subgenres of theatre for different audiences. So the same happens to the musical. So it becomes a good place to go for a date with your partner. There is a stereotype, and I will give you a link because this is still somehow present in the lore of the musical theatre, that it attracts a lot of gay men. Not necessarily the whole LGBT spectrum, but gay men. It's gay genre. Yes, it is true. Many people involved in the creation of the musicals were gay, but if we look at the LGBT themes in the musical theatre, we'll look at them at some much later stage in this semester. They do not appear before cabaret, really, and even then, and we are talking about the late 60s, they are only hinted. So it looks like it was something that many people assumed, but it was not necessarily reflected in the theatre itself. So much so that nowadays, and you'll have this link to the opening number from Tony Awards, performed by Neil Patrick Harris, who is a very, very famous musical actor and also openly gay. And he's making fun of the fact that there was this stereotype and the musical was supposedly to be something that mostly gay men would enjoy. Not true. What about the family entertainment then? This is another stereotype closely connected with the musical theatre, that it's supposed to be, again, some historian noted that the target audience is 11-year-olds. Why 11-year-olds? Because they can understand a little bit, they can read and write, so they have the basic literacy, but they do not know much about the world. So it's like for kids and for families, perhaps not the very little kids, but let's say early teens. Is it true? Well, of course there are lots of musicals for children and lots of musicals with child protagonists, not necessarily being musicals for children. We'll talk about them also at a later stage. But if you look at the history of the musical theatre, it really starts in the 90s with The Lion King, and the moment when Disney Corporation starts taking some interest in producing live shows based mostly on their successful cartoons. But if we look at the film musical, so for example, those successful films, animated films for children like Snow White, for example, they were very often a kind of musicals. They included songs, they included dance numbers. So if we think of The Wizard of Oz, if we think of Snow White and other Disney films, very often they included elements of music and dancing. So they were a kind of film musicals. Okay, Okay, to sum up all those stereotypes, there are also other stereotypes like is there some sort of political agenda in the musical? Is it conservative? Or perhaps it's radical? It gives the voice to counterculture. Again, we might think, when exactly? In the early years of Broadway, before the beginning of the rock musical in the 1960s, you might say that the majority of the musicals were conservative, very often nostalgic, very often they presented typical patriarchal view of the society, of the relationships between the sexes. But then when the rock musical starts, it just all goes bang. So you don't really have this combination of musical theatre and conservatism, even though the tickets were still quite expensive. So nowadays it's probably such a big genre with so much variety and so many artists, and of course there are those big expensive shows that require a lot of collaboration from a lot of people. This has always been an important thing about the musical. It was more expensive than regular theatre, because you had to pay more people, you had to pay the orchestra, for example. But there are also small experimental fringe productions, even one-person shows, which still can be called musicals, and sometimes they show a lot of I would say rebelliousness in the view of the world. So it's a vast genre. I am always a little bit irritated when people say I don't like musicals, because it usually means they don't like a particular style of musicals, or they don't like a particular show or a particular composer, which is of course utterly legit, but it's such a huge genre and there are so many shows and so many different themes that I'm sure that even those of you who at this point are quite skeptical will find something for yourself. So in a moment we'll start talking about the origins of the genre.